From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The east part of Aleppo city has fallen in the hands of Assad's forces again. More than 70% of the city destroyed.
With the aid of Russian airstrikes, the Syrian government has retaken near full control of the city of Aleppo after 4 years of fighting. Russia calls it a victory against terrorists. The United States says the Syrian government's siege of Aleppo represents a modern evil. We'll look at the crisis in Syria and U.S.-Russian relations at a time when the CIA is accusing Moscow of helping Donald Trump win the presidency. We'll speak to Professor Stephen Cohen, who writes for The Nation, and Kenneth Roth, head of Human Rights Watch. Then Donald Trump nominates former Texas Governor Rick Perry to head the Energy Department, a department Perry once proposed to abolish, even though he couldn't remember the department's name.
It's 3 agencies of government when I get there that are gone. Commerce, education, and the, what's the third one there? Let's see.
But you can't name the third one?
The third agency of government, yeah. I would do away with the education, commerce, and let's see. I can't.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Donald Trump has chosen former Texas Governor Rick Perry to be Energy Secretary. Governor Perry famously attempted to propose to abolish the Energy Department, but then couldn't remember the agency during a live televised debate in 2011 when he was running for president.
And I will tell you, it's 3 agencies of government when I get there that are gone. Commerce, education, and the, what's the third one there? Let's see.
You need 5.
Oh, 5. Okay. So commerce, education, and the
EPA?
EPA. There you go. No, okay.
Let's talk deposition.
Seriously? Is EPA the one you were talking about? Or?
No, sir. No, sir. We were talking about the agencies of government. EPA needs to be rebuilt. There's no doubt about that.
But you can't name the third one?
The third agency of government,
yeah.
I would do away with the education, commerce, and let's see. I can't. The third one I can't. Sorry. Oops.
That was Republican presidential candidate, Texas Governor Rick Perry, during a televised debate in 2011. He later told reporters the agency he'd forgotten was the Energy Department. Perry has deep ties to the fossil fuel industry, including serving on the corporate boards of both Energy Transfer Partners and Sunoco Logistics, 2 companies behind the Dakota Access Pipeline. Both companies are owned by Texas billionaire Kelsey Warren. Perry joined the board of Energy Transfer Partners in February 2015, only 2 weeks after he left office as governor. That year, Perry received $365,000 from Warren's companies. We'll have more on Perry later in the broadcast. The Energy Department is defying Donald Trump's transition team, saying it will not provide the names of people working on the Obama administration's climate policy. Last week, Trump's team circulated a 74-part questionnaire at the Department of Energy requesting the names of employees working on specific climate-related projects and the names of employees who've attended climate talks over the last 5 years. Many have denounced the move as the creation of an enemies list. Donald Trump has reportedly picked Montana Congressmember Ryan Zinke to be Interior Secretary. Zinke's denied scientists have proven the human impact of climate change. He's also long promoted mining and logging on federally held lands. The transition team had previously floated Washington State Congresswoman Kathy McMorris Rodgers as Trump's top pick for Interior Secretary, which Democracy Now! And other news outlets reported. The Environmental Protection Agency has released its final report on the impacts of fracking, concluding after a 6-year study that fracking does contaminate drinking water under some circumstances. The report found all stages of the fracking process have the potential to contaminate drinking water. It's the most comprehensive study on fracking to date, and it comes after years of residents reporting their water had been contaminated by the drilling process. Heads of the nation's top technology companies, including Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, are meeting with President-elect Donald Trump. An increasing number of technology workers in at least one major company have said they will not participate in the creation of a national registry for people from majority Muslim countries, one of Trump's campaign proposals. Hundreds of tech workers have signed on to a pledge titled Never Again, saying, quote, "We refuse to participate in the creation of databases of identifying information for the United States government to target individuals based on race, religion, or national origin," unquote. The company, Twitter, has also said it would not participate in the creation of such a database after being contacted by The Intercept. In Syria, a tentative ceasefire and evacuation plan for civilians and anti-government rebels in eastern Aleppo has reportedly collapsed this morning as Syrian government troops have seized near control over Aleppo. Anti-government activists from the Aleppo Media Center say Syrian government shelling continues in the few rebel-held areas, although Syrian state media says the fire is coming from the rebels. The UN said at least 82 civilians, including women and children, have been shot on site by Syrian government troops in recent days. The Syrian government offensive comes after eastern Aleppo has been besieged and bombarded for months by government forces and Russian airstrikes. Anti-government activists who first rose up against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in a democratic popular uprising in 2011 have called the fall of Aleppo doomsday. Russia has described it as a victory against terrorists and jihadists. We'll have more on Syria after headlines with Professor Stephen Cohen and Kenneth Roth, head of Human Rights Watch. The U.S. has reportedly halted the sale of some weapons to Saudi Arabia amidst mounting concerns about the U.S.-backed Saudi-led bombing campaign in Yemen. Since March 2015, more than 10,000 people have died in the ongoing conflict in Yemen, the vast majority killed by Saudi-led airstrikes. The U.S. has continued to sell warplanes and munitions to the Saudi-led coalition throughout the war, and U.S.-made munitions have been found at the scene of Saudi-led bombings where civilians have been killed. On Tuesday, an unnamed official told Reuters, quote, "We've decided not to move forward with some foreign military sales cases for airdrop munitions, PGMs, precision-guided munitions. That's obviously a direct reflection of the concerns that we have about Saudi strikes that have resulted in civilian casualties," they said. The ongoing war has also sparked a medical and hunger crisis. A new UNICEF report says in Yemen a child dies every 10 minutes because of malnutrition, diarrhea, or respiratory tract infection. The report also says Yemen's most heavily bombed region, the Sada Governorate, now has the world's highest rate of stunting, a system of chronic malnutrition in children. Human Rights Watch says satellite imagery shows the Burmese military intentionally razed Rohingya villages in the state of Rakhine. The United Nations has called on Burmese leader Aung San Suu Kyi to intervene and halt the military campaign against the long-persecuted Muslim ethnic group. The recent military campaign has reportedly included the rape and killing of civilians, as well as the use of helicopter gunships to open fire against Rohingyas below. The entire area has been sealed by a military order in order to keep out aid workers and journalists. At least 10,000 Rohingyas have been forced to flee into Bangladesh to escape the violence, while others have fled to nearby refugee camps. These are two refugees speaking from a camp in the capital of the state of Rakhine.
We have nothing to eat here. Our children are dying. We get support once in a month or two. How can we survive?
We do not have good health care. We sleep in poor conditions. It is very hot and there are no good roads. We have nothing to eat. All the food aid we had is gone now. Most of the families here cannot afford to cook rice now.
They are internally displaced Rohingyas. In more news on Burma, the Committee to Protect Journalists is demanding authorities investigate the murder of crime reporter Somo Tun. He was a journalist for the local newspaper Daily 11. He was in the process of investigating illegal logging and wood smuggling when his body was discovered Tuesday along the side of a road. In Mexico City, activists are protesting the eviction of the autonomous community space Chantiolín, which was violently raided last month by hundreds of riot police with military equipment, including 2 helicopters and a tank. The space was one of the oldest squats in Mexico City, was located in the rapidly gentrifying downtown financial district. On Monday, activists protested outside the Attorney General's office to demand officials return the space to the community and close the cases against the 26 people who were arrested during the eviction on November 22nd. In financial news, Wells Fargo has failed for the second time this year the living will regulatory test, a key evaluation established after the 2008 financial crisis. The test judges whether banks have plans in place to avoid crashing the global economy in the event of a bank failure. Wells Fargo also failed this test in April. Wells Fargo is already increasing scrutiny over its financing of the Dakota Access Pipeline, as well as the massive scandal over the creation of 2 million fake accounts, which Wells Fargo employees opened in order to meet grueling sales targets. At Standing Rock in North Dakota, water protectors fighting the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline are calling on Morton County to drop an arrest warrant issued for Brennan Nastasio, the Pueblo water protector who disarmed a Dakota Access security contractor attempting to infiltrate the resistance camps on October 27th. A video shows Nastasio convincing pipeline security contractor Kyle Thompson to stop pointing his AR-15 rifle at the Native Americans and then hand over his 30-round clip. Thompson was later arrested by Bureau of Indian Affairs police, but Morton County went on to release Thompson without charges and instead issue an arrest warrant for the water protector Nastasio on charges of felony terrorizing. Nastasio has also been placed on Morton County's most wanted list. This is Pueblo water protector Brennan Nastasio.
To be on Morton County's most wanted list sends me a message that Morton County doesn't care about the people at camp. They would have rather let Kyle Thompson come in and shoot everybody at camp than for me to disarm him. I hope that ain't the case, Morton County. I hope they realize that I saved lives that day and drop this arrest warrant that they have out for me. I approached Kyle Thompson to disarm him because I was concerned about the safety of the camp.
In Ohio, Governor John Kasich has vetoed a piece of anti-abortion legislation that would have banned abortion from the moment a heartbeat can be detected, which is usually about 6 months into pregnancy. But he did sign it 6 weeks into pregnancy. But he did sign into law Tuesday another extreme piece of anti-choice legislation that bans the procedure after 20 weeks of pregnancy, even in the case of rape or incest. The ACLU has vowed to challenge the law, which it says is unconstitutional. Meanwhile, in Oklahoma, lawmakers have approved new regulations that will require all facilities with public bathrooms licensed by the state health department to post anti-choice signs advertising pregnancy crisis centers and other anti-abortion websites and information. Starting in 2011, the signs would be required in all hospitals, restaurants, and public schools under the Humanity of the Unborn Child Act. The regulations were pushed by the anti-choice group Oklahomans for Life with the goal of, quote, achieving an abortion-free society, unquote. And in Bakersfield, California, more than 100 residents and family members gathered for a candlelight vigil Tuesday night for Francisco Serna, a 73-year-old man who was shot 7 times by police just after midnight Monday as he was taking a walk in his neighborhood. Serna's family says he suffered from the early stages of dementia and that he would take walks at night when he was having trouble sleeping. Police say they were responding to a call about an armed man walking around the neighborhood, but the police later admitted Serna did not have a gun or any weapon. Instead, the police said Serna was carrying a crucifix. Bakersfield is in Kern County. In 2015, Kern had the highest rate of police killings per capita of any county in the United States. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. With the aid of Russian airstrikes, Syria has taken near full control of the city of Aleppo in a major defeat for forces hoping to topple Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Before fighting began in 2012, Aleppo was Syria's largest city with a population of over 2 million. Some of the first major peaceful protests against Assad's rule broke out in Aleppo in March 2011. But today, the city is in shambles after 4 years of fighting between Syria and rebel groups. A turning point in the Battle of Aleppo occurred in September 2015 when Russia began carrying out airstrikes to aid the Syrian government. Negotiations are now ongoing for a truce to allow the evacuation of civilians living in the areas once held by rebel forces. An initial truce collapsed earlier today. Ismail al-Abdullah, a volunteer with the Syrian Civil Defense, or White Helmets, said civilians had been executed by government forces.
When SS forces captured Al-Bustan al-Qasr neighborhood and Al-Fardos neighborhood, Assad forces, when they entered this neighborhood, they executed 82 people, and the relatives of the victims who are now with us told us they were executed, including 13 kids and 7 women. All of them were executed, and what we are now and what we worry about our souls, that maybe the genocide will happen in the coming days if nothing will stop them in the coming hours.
Russia described the fall of Aleppo as a victory against terrorists and jihadists, but the United States has decried the Russian-backed offensive. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Samantha Power said, quote, "Aleppo will join the ranks of those events in world history that define modern evil, that stain our conscience decades later. Halabja, Rwanda, Srebrenica, and now Aleppo," unquote. The UN said at least 82 civilians, including women and children, have been shot on sight by Syrian government troops in recent days. To talk more about Syria, as well as how the fall of Aleppo impacts U.S.-Russian relations, we're joined by 2 guests. Kenneth Roth is with us, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. His new article for the New York Review of Books is headlined, "What Trump Should Do in Syria." And Stephen Cohen also joins us, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at New York University and Princeton University. He's a contributing editor at The Nation magazine. Welcome both to Democracy Now! Ken Roth, let's begin with you. What's happened in Syria, and talk about Russia's role?
Well, we're all focused on Aleppo right now, and I think, as you mentioned earlier, Aleppo has been the victim of several months of a siege, basically a starvation of everybody there, not simply the fighters, but up to 250,000 civilians. It also has been the victim of ongoing bombardment by Syrian and Russian forces. And what's notable about the way this war has been fought, and Aleppo is no exception to this, is that the Syrian-Russian combination have not simply aimed at fighters on the other side, which is what you're supposed to do in war, but they have deliberately targeted civilians and civilian institutions like hospitals or markets and the like. And the aim is to make life so miserable that people either flee or the enclave ultimately topples. That's been this tactic in other areas, and now that has been successful in Aleppo. This is an overt war crime strategy, and it's been Assad's method of fighting the war from the outset. And Russia very much joined it when, a little over a year ago, in September 2015, it joined in. We had all hoped at that stage that the greater precision that Russian Air Force brought to the fighting would enable a more targeted approach. In fact, they just continued the policy of targeting civilians. Now, we had hoped, as of last night, that for the remaining civilians in Aleppo, as well as the fighters, apparently, that there would be an evacuation. That had been arranged. But this morning, Shia militia backed by Iran blocked that deal and resumed shelling the area. This is of deep concern because, as you heard from the White Helmet individual, there have been executions in Aleppo when pro-government forces have entered. They, in particular, have been targeting the families of fighters. These are well known, and they're going door to door and executing women and children, and as well as others who are there. So there's deep concern that if the people who remain in eastern Aleppo cannot get out, that they too may face these kinds of summary executions.
So are you accusing Russia and Syria of war crimes here?
Absolutely. In other words, I mean, the fighters on the ground today are principally either Syrian or, I mean, the other major forces that have been backing Syria on the ground have been Iran and Hezbollah. Russia has been playing mainly an aerial role. but and often you can't tell which plane is which. There are various efforts, but the combination of the Assad-Putin air forces have been deliberately bombing civilians and civilian institutions time and time again. You speak to people in hospitals who report being targeted over and over again until ultimately the hospital is destroyed. And this, sadly, has been the strategy that Putin and Assad have pursued in Syria. This is a blatant war crime. The Geneva Conventions require that you take all feasible precautions to spare civilians. In this case, the deliberate purpose has been to target civilians. It's a blatant war crime.
Professor Stephen Cohen.
Is anybody here old enough to remember the expression fog of war? I think it may have originated in World War I, I'm not sure. But then when you get a war, you have a very difficult time getting reliable information about what's going on. There are several narratives about the Syrian civil proxy war, and that's what it is. A lot of great powers, or would-be great powers, involved in Syria. The United States and Russia are involved in a proxy war there. It's a civil war. The account Mr. Roth just gave is only one of 2 or 3 competing narratives. One narrative is, and in war, innocents die. That's why we're all anti-war. He says that the Russians joined with the Syrians in deliberate war crimes. This is based on very selective reports that come from sources that cannot be verified. For example, the white helmet man that you had testified to this didn't tell us how he knew that, how he observed it, how he escaped with his own life. Moreover, there are people who doubt the reports that come from the white helmets, that they have an agenda. So the rest of us are left here trying to weigh the different narratives. Mr. Ross is a very extreme set of accusations. What Samantha Power has said at the United Nations over a long period of time can't be taken at face value because she has performed there not as an ambassador, but as a propagandist for a certain point of view. The problem here is that what's the alternative to ending the siege of Aleppo? Now, you, Amy, Mr. Roth, and the New York Times have dropped the word jihadist and terrorist from your narrative. I don't know if you're aware you've done that. You may have done this because the New York Times, until September, why was September important? Because President Obama had proposed to join with President Putin in what Mr. Roth now calls war crimes. That is, a military alliance against the people who were holding Aleppo captive, and they called them terrorists. When our Department of Defense sabotaged that potential Russian-American alliance in Aleppo, in Syria, suddenly the narrative, and we're back to the fog of war, changed. The New York Times, for example, and many of us who depend on the Times or the Washington Post for our information, suddenly changed the narrative. There were no longer any terrorists in Aleppo, no longer any jihadists, but people called rebels. And since our nation began in rebellion against Great Britain, rebels have a rather positive connotation. The reality is, I think, at least this is what the United States government told us until September, that terrorists were holding large parts of eastern Aleppo. They were not letting innocent civilians use the multiple corridors out of the city that the Russians, yes, there's plenty of testimony to this, had opened up and guaranteed that people could not escape the city because of these terrorists. Then suddenly, when the American-Russian Obama's plan to cooperate with Putin there disappeared, apparently all the jihadists and the terrorists disappeared. So we're left today in a fog of war. Perhaps Mr. Roth is correct, but I don't think he's fully correct. And we have 2 narratives. Either we have witnessed the liberation of Aleppo, and then we would say this is a good thing, or we're witnessing war crimes by the Russians and the Syrians in Aleppo, which is a bad thing. So I would ask Mr. Roth, if the Russians hadn't done what he alleged they would do. What was the alternative to setting the people of Aleppo free?
Ken Roth.
Let me begin with this fog of war argument, because, you know, when there's nothing to say, when there's nothing to defend, let's resort to the fog of war. I mean, I've heard this argument many, many times. This is not fog of war. We know exactly what is going on. Human Rights Watch has teams on the ground based in Beirut, occasionally going into Syria, in regular communication with people in Aleppo and other places. We don't publish until we know exactly what is going on, until we corroborate and we're certain. So this is not a matter of just, you know, taking some jihadist propagandist and repeating it. We know exactly what is happening. And there is no question that the bombardment has been targeting civilians and civilian institutions. There is no question that the siege was starving everybody, including the 250,000 civilians. So, you know, fog of war, please. You know, this is the reality. Now, what could have been done? We speak about terrorists, and so let's get specific here. When people use that term, they generally refer to two groups. One is the Islamic State, or ISIS. ISIS is actually not in Aleppo at all. The U.S., working with its Kurdish allies, is fighting ISIS, you know, in Iraq, around Mosul, and in Syria, around Raqqa. And Russia, for the most part, and Assad have largely been ignoring that fight. They've been focusing on Aleppo. Now, in Aleppo, there are what are known as sort of the moderate rebels, and then there's a group that the United States agrees is a terrorist. It's an al-Qaeda affiliate until very recently, when it supposedly distanced itself from al-Qaeda, traditionally known as Jabhat al-Nusra. The Jabhat al-Nusra forces are a relatively small component of the people in Aleppo, but the U.S. has agreed with Russia that it would like to see those people defeated. Now, you know, however you feel about that, however you feel about the other rebels, the issue here is not who wins. The issue is the method of warfare. And the right way to proceed is you shoot at the combatants on the other side. That's what the laws of war are all about. Unfortunately, Putin and Assad have chosen to target the civilians who also live there. It's a very deliberate strategy. Make life so miserable that ultimately the city has no choice but to capitulate. Now, you know, there is tremendous fear on the part of civilians in all of these enclaves who are targeted. And they, on the one hand, they fear staying there because they're facing the bombardment by the Russian and the Syrian troops. On the other hand, they fear going over into Syrian hands because, you know, we know what happens in Syrian prisons. We've seen extensive torture and execution. We have photos of, you know, thousands of people who have died in those prisons. And so if you're a young man, for example, you basically are facing a choice. You know, do you either risk your life in Assad's detention facilities, or, you know, what they're all increasingly doing is forcing you to just get into the Syrian military and go to the front line, you know, essentially a suicide mission there. So it is, you know, a very poor possibility. Now, many families are staying with their relatives who are fighters, and these are the people who are being first targeted by the pro-government forces that are coming in. So we are, you know, this is not about, you know, how do you defeat terrorists. This is about slaughter of civilians. So we should keep that focus.
Slaughter of civilians. The United Nations calls it a meltdown of humanity. Stephen Cohn.
Well, the United Nations has issued conflicting reports. There's a bit of a struggle at the United Nations about what to say about all this. Look, Mr. Roth's organization does God's work. No question about it. But for millennia, we've argued exactly what God's work is. One can support what Human Rights Watch does with great enthusiasm, make a donation, urge Mr. Roth on, and still question his narrative. He asserts absolutely verifiable sources. The reality is he doesn't. He criticizes me for saying fog of war, but there are other reports that have to be taken into account. The charge that Russia deliberately targets civilian facilities and centers is, of course, part of the growing anti-Russian line that's captured our politics and has led to this scandal in Washington. I think we need to step back for a minute. And I won't speak of my own involvement in human rights or civil liberties because I'm older than both of you, and I would have you at a disadvantage because I'm not sure you even remember these struggles. You do, but I'm not talking about only in the South, but in Russia and elsewhere. Putin said prior to sending his Air Force to Syria, just over a year ago, in September 2015, I think, said it at the United Nations. He said it to President Obama. He said it at every press conference. During the period, 3-year period prior to that, the United States claimed it was fighting the Islamic State. And of course, Mr. Roth is right. There are different terrorist groups fighting in Syria, some in Palmyra, some in Aleppo. During the 3 years, the United States claimed to have been fighting the Islamic State. The Islamic State gained more and more and more territory after the fall of Libya, or after we overthrew Gaddafi. It gained more territory in Iraq, and it gained an enormous territory in Syria, and something new emerged in the world. A terrorist organization that had actually turned itself into a real state. I mean, it was governing these territories, running municipal facilities, collecting taxes. This was something new and exceedingly dangerous. So Putin said we have a choice. Who do we want in Damascus, the capital of Syria? Do we want Assad, the president of Syria, or do we want the Islamic State in Damascus? This was the key policy difference between the United States and Russia. The Obama administration had pursued, in fact, a policy of overthrowing Assad, dealing with terrorists in Syria, some of whom we funded, as Mr. Roth well knows, because they claimed to be anti-Assad, meant that, in fact, as we pursued the war against Assad, the Islamic State took more and more territory, and Russia decided it had had enough because it believed Syria was vital to its national security. And it intervened, and the war has been turned around. The United States has been on the wrong side of history from the beginning of this. The United States has made its contribution, since Vietnam at least, to the destruction of hospitals and civilian facilities, most recently in Afghanistan. Was it deliberate? I don't know. It was probably an accident. In Mr. Roth's absolutist view, everything is certain, everything is deliberate. I'm more problematic. But look what's happening in Syria today. It's extremely interesting. The Russians and the Syrians, some months ago, took back Palmyra, this historic city, where the Islamic State had been chopping off heads in public, where it had lined up its victims and had young children, looked to be about 10, 11, 12, execute them. I'm sure Human Rights Watch reported that and protested it. And then the Russians and the Syrians liberated the city. Now, Palmyra is under siege again. The Islamic State may take control of the city. What's the United States doing about it? This is what we should be asking. This is our country now, not Russia. Let me finish my point. You filibustered. Let me just make my last point. He hasn't mentioned Mosul, by the way, and whether the same thing is happening in Mosul. The American-led... One second, please. There are verifiable reports that jihadists in Mosul are fleeing because of the Iraqi-American war there. Where are they going? They're going to Syria. The United States has bombers in that area. They could stop these people from going to Syria. They're headed, I would guess, toward Palmyra. Why is the United States allowing these jihadists, these terrorists, to go to Syria? Because possibly they want them to take back Palmyra from the Russians and the Syrians. Now, we don't know if that's true, but the American role is highly suspect. And rather than sit here and say the Russians are committing war crimes, because look, one person's war crime is another person's liberation. On the front page of the New York Times this very morning, there's a story by Ann Barnard. By the way, Americans are not filing from Syria, they're filing from Beirut. So they're depending on different sources. But she makes an interesting point. She repeats what Mr. Roth says that about people being executed by the Syrian army. But she goes on to say these can't be verified. And then 2 or 3 paragraphs later, she reports that people trapped in Aleppo are welcoming the Syrian army with jubilation. She reports. So even in the New York Times, which has not been very helpful in these narratives, you see the two narratives. And undoubtedly, part of what Mr. Roth said is absolutely true. Part of it is part of the position that he has taken more generally about Russia being mainly responsible for virtually everything that bad is happening in the world. And I just end by saying that, in my judgment, the real threat to our national security at this moment, number one, is not unfolding in Syria, but in Washington, D.C.
All right, let's get back to reality here. The U.S. has been bombing ISIS in both Mosul and in Raqqa. Professor Cohen says jihadists are fleeing Mosul. That was several weeks ago. Since then, it's actually been encircled, and so they're not fleeing. But there's no question that the U.S. is actively bombing in Iraq. It's backed by government forces and Kurdish forces on the ground. In Syria, it's backed by predominantly Kurdish forces with a Syrian component to it. That war seems to be progressing slowly. If you look at what the Russian role in this has been, yes, a year ago, Russia retook Palmyra from ISIS. These days, it's been focusing entirely on Aleppo, where there is no ISIS. If you look at, there's a group called the Institute for the Study of War, which puts out very interesting maps, basically once a month, to show where the bombardment is. And so they show the Russian bombardment. And you can see all these little explosives around Aleppo and, one or two around Raqqa or Palmyra. I've tweeted that on my Twitter account if people want to find it. There's no question that the focus of Russia and Assad today has not been ISIS. They use the terrorist rhetoric, but they've been going after the opponents of the Assad regime. Now, that's their choice. For me, the issue is how they fight the war. Now, Professor Cohen says, I'm just making this up, that they're targeting civilians. Look at the hospitals. They're a very good illustration. Until September 2015, at a point where it was just the Syrian Air Force in the skies, they were using these so-called barrel bombs, which were very imprecise weapons. They're essentially canisters filled with explosives and shrapnel, which would tumble to earth, very difficult to target. Since the Russians entered the war, they've got precision weapons. And so you talk to the doctors, which I've done repeatedly, and they describe much more precise hits on the hospital. And this is not a mistake. This is over and over and over until the hospital is destroyed. There is no question that these hospitals are being deliberately targeted. You can say, fog of war. But last time I checked, the only people in the sky over Aleppo are the Russians and the Syrians. There's no one else.
We're going to have to break, and then we're going to come back to this discussion and go to this issue that Professor Cohen has raised, Washington, the Russia-U.S. relationship. We're speaking with Professor Stephen Cohen, taught Russian studies at both New York University and Princeton, now writes for The Nation, and Kenneth Roth, who's Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. Stay with us. Music by Lena Shamian here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to take a broader look at U.S.-Russian relations in the wake of Donald Trump's election. On Tuesday, Trump officially nominated Rex Tillerson, chair and CEO of ExxonMobil, to be Secretary of State. Tillerson's known to have close ties to Russian President Vladimir Putin, who awarded Tillerson the country's Order of Friendship Decoration in 2013. One of the focuses of the Senate confirmation hearings will be Exxon's $500 billion oil exploration partnership with the Russian government's oil company Rosneft. Considered the largest oil deal in history, the partnership can only go through if the U.S. lifts sanctions against Russia, which the Obama administration imposed over Russia's intervention in Ukraine. The news of Tillerson's nomination came just days after the CIA accused Russia of meddling in the U.S. election to help Donald Trump win. Trump has rejected the CIA's conclusion, decrying it as ridiculous. But President Obama ordered a review of Russia's role in influencing the presidential election. Still with us, Kenneth Roth, who is Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, and Stephen Cohen, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at New York University and Princeton University. Stephen Cohen, start with the elections.
Be more precise.
What we understand, what the U.S. allegations are around Russian intervention in the elections. The New York Times today has a major top story, hacking the Democrats, how Russia honed the cyber power and trained it on an American election.
I don't know where to begin. Let me context it, because when you first had me on February 2014, I said we were headed for a new Cold War with Russia, and it would be more dangerous than the last one. That has happened. We now have 3 Cold War fronts that are fraught with hot war, the possibility of hot war: the Baltic area, Ukraine, and Syria, between 2 nuclear powers. Things are very, very dangerous. We desperately need in this country a discussion of American policy toward Russia. We can't keep saying an untruth that this new Cold War is solely the fault of Putin. We need to rethink our policy, at least over 20 years, but over the last 5 or 6 years, toward Russia. That has been made even more impossible now with this slurring of anybody who disagrees from the official American position of how the Cold War arose. The slurring began against people such as myself 2 or 3 years ago. We were called Putin apologists, Kremlin toadies, Kremlin clients. It moved on to even accuse Henry Kissinger of that. And then, of course, when Trump came along, this was a great blessing to these people who were essentially neo-McCarthyites. It spread to the New York Times. So we have this allegation that the Russians deliberately, word Mr. Roth likes, I think there's more accident and miscalculation in history than he seems to think, deliberately, on the orders of Putin, hacked into the Democratic National Committee, and not only, in order to, and here the narrative gets a little puzzling, the original intention was simply to throw American democracy into chaos, cast disrepute on the American political system, but then they realized that they could actually throw the election to Trump. Now we have the New York Times, what used to be a newspaper we thought would protect us from these kinds of allegations, saying in an editorial that they did this, the Russians did this, because Trump is surrounded by Kremlin lackeys. This is an extremely serious and reckless allegation that our new president is surrounded by Kremlin lackeys. They don't name names, but we know how they mean, what they mean. And both the editorial page of the Time and Paul Krugman, who, after all, won a Nobel Prize and once was my colleague at Princeton as an economist. It's really astonishing to see what he now writes, says that Trump won only because of what the Russians did. What we have from the CIA, which itself is divided, we know that there are different opinions in the CIA, we have yet to be presented with a single fact. In this New York Times story, which rehearses basically New York Times miscoverage of this whole episode, they do the same thing. They are assessments, which is judgment. They are allegations, but no one has produced how they know this with facts. Did they tap into Russian cell phones? Do they have a mole in Putin's inner circle who's telling them? Do they have satellite surveillance? We don't know. Let me bring to your attention something that's not been reported. There's a group of very serious former American intelligence officers called, I think, Veteran Intelligence Officers for Sanity. I'm not sure.
VIPS.
You know them. And they issued a report yesterday. I can't judge it. I'm not an intelligence person in that sense. But they believe this wasn't hacking at all, but leaking. That somebody leaked this stuff from the Democratic, in other words, somebody in the United States. So here we have no facts presented by the CIA. The FBI itself will not go along because it's a fact organization. It's got to have evidence that's presentable in a court. We have the possibility, I don't know, but it's offered by credible people, that this wasn't hacking but leaking. And the result is we're having the new president called essentially a Kremlin lackey. Senator McCain has said, to his eternal discredit, that Putin is a bully, a liar, an invader of countries, a man who's determined to destroy the American way of life, and adds, if anybody doesn't agree with Senator McCain, he's a liar. So
he also calls Putin a killer. Do you agree with
murder.
that?
No, I do not. Well, I mean, killer in warfare, yes. He didn't. Oh, well, McCain went on to say that Putin had personally ordered the killing of Boris Nemtsov, a Russian opposition who was shot down on a bridge. No one in Moscow takes that seriously, not even Nemtsov's family. But the point we have here, Amy, and this is exceedingly dangerous, is that we have a new accepted practice of labeling anyone who dissents from American policy toward Russia as a Kremlin apologist. And I know very serious people who have become afraid to speak out now because they don't want to be labeled.
So let's get Kenneth Roth's response, and also to the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, House Speaker Paul Ryan, of course, both Republicans, announcing their support for an investigation into whether Russia did hack the elections.
Well, by all means, there should be an investigation. I mean, why not?
Sure.
You got to be very careful, though, when there are accusations against Russia, and the response is new Cold War, as if let's not look into this, might be a new Cold War. Let's look at the reality here. In Syria, we've just discussed this. There's been Putin's involvement in the deliberate targeting of civilians. Ukraine, I mean, Amy, you made a major faux pas by saying that Russia invaded Ukraine. That was utterly denied by the Kremlin for a long time. It was the little green men in Crimea until suddenly it was Russian forces. It was, just a spontaneous uprising in eastern Ukraine until suddenly there were Russian forces behind all that. So, the truth is malleable when it's useful. And I think we should be focusing on the reality. Now, I have no special insight into the hacking allegations. By all means, there should be an investigation. And I am concerned about Trump's nominee for Secretary of State because, here's a guy, Rex Tillerson, who has had a career in cozying up to autocrats around the world, in the name of big oil. And he has developed very good relations with Angola, with Equatorial Guinea, and with Putin. And I worry about whether a man like that, who has put the interests of big oil ahead of everything else, is going to be able to pursue a foreign policy where, in theory, the promotion of human rights was a major part of it. One thing these autocrats all have in common is a general disregard for human rights. And is this the person we want in charge of our foreign policy?
And this issue of if he is chosen, and Exxon's desire to have these sanctions lifted, the largest oil deal in not just U.S., but in world history, if these sanctions are lifted, would benefit his company.
Well, no, clearly ExxonMobil didn't like the sanctions that were imposed on Russia because of the adventurism of these little green men that have nothing to do with the Kremlin in eastern Ukraine. And ExxonMobil fought that. Now this is not a human rights issue. It's not something that Human Rights Watch has taken a position on, but it does raise questions about what is the primary concern of Rex Tillerson, and can he really, after having spent his entire career at big oil, his entire career, professional life at ExxonMobil, suddenly switch hats and pursue other values as the head of the State Department?
Then this issue that Professor Cohen raises of a new McCarthyism.
Well, that's another way of saying, a new Cold War. Just because you start accusing people who say bad things about Putin of McCarthyism doesn't mean it's not true. I mean, these big labels don't help. Let's look at the facts. Who actually did act in Ukraine? Was it really just a spontaneous uprising, or was there a Russian role in this? Who is providing the precision weapons in Syria that have been targeting civilians and civilian institutions? Nobody else has an air force like that other than Russia. Nobody even pretends that there are planes up there above Aleppo other than Russia with their Syrian allies. So, you got to get down to the reality here. And I don't think throwing around these names of new Cold War or accusing people of McCarthyite tactics has anything to do with this. Let's get to the facts, and the facts are pretty ugly right now.
Very quickly, I presume, Professor Cohen, that you have some concerns about Donald Trump, or any of them around his relationship with, or the relationship with his professed admiration for Putin.
Well, I'm kind of startled by a number of things that Mr. Roth said, and I don't like the way he dismisses everything I say as kind of a way of avoiding it by referring to a new Cold War and what happened in Ukraine. I don't think he really knows what happened in Ukraine, but that could be a separate discussion between us. And then he goes back to Syria. But what surprises me is that a man who represents human rights, one of which is freedom of speech, or as Roosevelt would say, freedom of fear of speech, of being afraid to speak out, isn't worried about this new neo-McCarthyism and isn't on my side on this, that we should stop this. And he's kind of, let me finish, he's kind of mangled it. I didn't say that anybody who says something bad about Putin is the target of this neo-McCarthyism. What I said was, anybody who dissents from the orthodox account of how we ended up in this new Cold War, and if Mr. Roth thinks it's not a new Cold War, he's welcome to that thought, though he'll miss all the attendant dangers. It's the people who speak out who are being called apologists for Putin, and it's chilling debate here. So let me make the point I began at the beginning.
We have 30 seconds.
All right, I can say it in 10. We're in the most dangerous confrontation with Russia since the Cuban Missile Crisis. It needs to be discussed, and at the moment it can't be discussed because of these charges that everybody is a client of Putin who disagrees with the mainstream opinion. And it's coming from the Senate, it's coming from the New York Times, it's coming from, and I wish we had a second to say what the motives are. But one motive is to keep Trump from going to the White House. Another is to delegitimize him before he gets there. But the main motive, and you can hear it clearly, is Trump has said he wants cooperation with Russia, and the war party here that's against that is determined to stop it. And the way you do it is level against Putin the kinds of accusations that Mr. Roth uncritically levels, so the rest of us will say we can't have any cooperations with Putin because he's a war criminal.
20 seconds, Ken Roth.
I'm all for talking with Putin, trying to cooperate with him. In fact, my New York Review piece argues that the key to Syria is for Trump to put pressure on Putin because Assad wouldn't be able to commit these atrocities without Putin's active support.
Not talking with Putin. That's putting pressure on Putin.
And talk to him, too. And we never objected to the ongoing debate, the ongoing conversation, but it shouldn't be in lieu of the kind of pressure which is all that Putin listens to these days.
Oh, for God's sake. That's all he listens to. And you base that on what? Your careful study of Putin, your following of Russian politics.
I've watched
at some point, let's be fact-based, okay?
I've watched him for 2 years talk with Kerry and Lavrov, and he just continued with the atrocities. The only way to ratchet up, the only way he has made any change in Syria is when the pressure mounts.
We're going to have to leave it there. We're going to have to leave it there, but I want to thank you both for being a part of this discussion. Stephen Cohen is a professor emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at Princeton and New York University, and Kenneth Roth is Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we look at Trump's pick to be the Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry. Stay with us. The death of democracy, the Frackettes. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Donald Trump has chosen former Texas Governor Rick Perry to be Energy Secretary. Governor Perry famously attempted to propose to abolish the Energy Department, but then couldn't remember the name of the agency during a live televised presidential debate in 2011.
It's 3 agencies of government when I get there that are gone. Commerce, education, and the, what's the third one there? Let's see.
But you can't name the third one?
The third agency of government, yeah. I would do away with the education, the commerce, and let's see. I can't.
That was Rick Perry during the televised presidential debate in 2011. He later told reporters the agency he'd forgotten was the Energy Department. Well, Governor Perry has deep ties to the fossil fuel industry, including serving on the corporate boards of both Energy Transfer Partners and Sunoco Logistics, two companies behind the Dakota Access Pipeline. Both companies are owned by Texas billionaire Kelsey Warren. Perry joined the board of Energy Transfer Partners in February 2015, 2 weeks after he left office. That year, he received $365,000 from Warren's companies. In 2015, Kelsey Warren also served as Rick Perry's campaign finance chair during Perry's presidential bid and donated $6 million to pro-Perry super PACs. For more, we're going to Austin, Texas. We're joined by two guests. Forrest Wilder is editor-in-chief of the Texas Observer, and Kia Collier is the energy and environment reporter for the Texas Tribune. Her recent article is headlined, "Rick Perry's Energy Legacy is More Complicated Than You Think." We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's start with Forrest Wilder. Your assessment of Rick Perry, the former governor of Texas, to be the head of, wait, what was the name of the department? The Energy Department. Well, that's what he couldn't remember when he said he wanted to abolish it in 2011. Your thoughts on this pick, Forrest?
Well, I think a lot of us were astonished. There's been a lot of remarkable political news in the Trump transition. But picking the guy who forgot the department that he wanted to abolish is pretty incredible. I assume that Perry doesn't now want to abolish the Energy Department that he's now probably going to head. I'm sort of scratching my head, I think, a little bit about what Trump sees in Rick Perry. As you noted, he has served on his corporate boards after his governorship, although, you know, it's Texas and the oil and gas business is huge here, and politicians often cash out when they leave office. He was governor of Texas, of course, for 14 years, the longest-serving governor in Texas history. But, you know, Rick Perry is not exactly a details guy. He's not a policy guy. Though he was in office for a really long time, actually his record of accomplishment in terms of really big initiatives that he was responsible for, that you can certainly say that Rick Perry's imprimatur was on this program or this policy, is actually really quite short. In fact, and I was thinking back about what were his major proposals, and most of what I thought of were basically kind of pretty big failures. Some of them won't be known outside of Texas, but here they were very big deals. For example, the Trans-Texas Corridor was this proposal to build this very expensive this network of toll roads and highways that involved public-private partnerships. It was
Forrest, I'm going to interrupt because I want to give Kia a chance to respond, and then we're going to continue this discussion and post online. Kia Collier, if you could talk about Rick Perry's close ties to Kelsey Warren, certainly the center of a massive national controversy around the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Right. Perry, I think, has been pretty close to Warren, both personally and professionally, for a long time. Kelsey Warren has given him a ton of money, a ton of political support. And when he stepped down as Texas governor in 2015, he was shortly thereafter appointed to the board of Energy Transfer Partners. You know, we explored those kind of conflicts of interest, I guess, in our piece. And experts told us, you know, he's probably going to have to step down from his board position on Energy Transfer Partners if he, you know, is confirmed to head the Energy Department.
Well, we're going to leave it there and then do part 2 of this discussion and post it at DemocracyNow.org. Kia Collier of the Texas Tribune and Forrest Wilder of the Texas Observer, thank you so much for joining us. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Dina Guzder, Sam Alcoff, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Shrina Ndura, Andre Lewis, Miguel Noguera, Mike DeFilippo, and Paul Huckabee, our engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.